He was a retired federal judge, a black man with a cane just walking through a park. But within minutes, he became a suspicious person to a young officer. What happened next? It didn't just change the officer. It started a quiet revolution. Stay with this story. It may change how you see the world around you. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. He appeared ordinary. An old, quiet man in a charcoal overcoat, white hair trimmed neatly, leaning on a polished wooden cane as he navigated Central Park's winding pathways. Yet the moment he stepped past the wrought iron gate just after sunrise, something in the air shifted. The golden light fell across his dark skin in a way that beckoned attention, though no one seemed to notice. Oscar Sinclair, 72, former federal appellate judge from Washington, D.C., was more accustomed to courtrooms than morning strolls in New York, but today he followed the same route he had walked for years whenever visiting his daughter's family nearby. He moved deliberately, cane-tapping breath, even an old man carrying nothing but dignity and quiet purpose. Yet even as he walked, the world around him seemed in denial. Passers-by sidestepped, unconsciously tourists steered clear, and a lone street vendor paused mid-serve, eyebrows lifting. No alarm sounded. Still, the silent disdain of wrong assumptions formed its own kind of tension in the park. Oscar did not hurry. He never did. But he wasn't blind to the sideways stares, curious glances at his cane and coat, the barely suppressed disgust at a black man walking without apology in a neighborhood others considered theirs by default. A young police officer materialized at the end of an intersection, his uniform crisp badge gleaming in the sunlight. He watched Oscar for a heartbeat, just long enough for the old judge to meet his gaze. Oscar nodded politely, as though acknowledging a colleague. The officer nodded back, but his eyes narrowed. Something about Oscar's calm unsettled him. Instinct flickered. The officer approached. "Good morning, sir," the officer said, voice steady. Oscar paused his cane mid-tap against the stone path. He turned fully. The silence stretched between them. Oscar's voice, when it came, was soft, measured. "Good morning, officer. May I help you?" There was nothing threatening in him. Only the image of a black man with white hair and a cane, and a man in uniform, required to decide whether that sight needed intervention. The officer swallowed. He had no specific complaint to point to, no suspicious behavior noted. If someone had called in a suspicious person, who or what did they see? Oscar smiled gently, a gesture so sublimely human that it diffused the moment. But it raised new questions in that officer's mind. A man this old, this composed, surely he couldn't belong here. The stillness became a mirror to the officer's own impatience. Seconds passed, but Oscar's story wasn't rooted in pulse and second-guessing. He had written decisions that shaped American jurisprudence, defined civil rights precedents, protected marginalized voices. His life had been built in courtrooms, under pressure, not in obscure park paths. But at that moment, the history of his achievements meant nothing to the observer. "Sir, can I see some identification?" The bones of surprise rattled in Oscar's chest. In court, contenders presented credentials freely. Outside in uniform, he was suddenly a suspect. He lifted his cane, placed hand to chest. "My ID," he repeated, a touch of weary incredulity in his tone. "Why standard procedure?" the officer replied unsteadily. Oscar nodded. He reached into his overcoat, retrieved a leather wallet, and offered it with grace. Yet even that gesture seemed foreign in this exchange of monotony and bureaucracy. He observed the officer's hesitation, tiny cracks in composure, and held himself still. He said nothing else because he didn't have to. The cane tapped again. The line between citizen and suspect blurred faster than his pulse rose. Onlookers paused in their routines. A baby stroller veered off course. A jogger slowed. Neither spoke as the officer examined the license name and photo. Oscar Sinclair. White hair, brown eyes, 72 years old, but his gaze remained deeper than a glance could reach. The officer looked up, recognition dawning behind his eyes. Oscar saw it, the realization that he was not just some man in a coat, but a life built in the public eye, a life shaped by law justice authority. But Oscar remained quiet, waiting for the officer's words. The crease between the younger man's eyebrows sank deeper. After long minutes, he replaced the ID and stammered, "Everything seems in order, sir. Thank you." Oscar nodded, replaced his wallet, and started forward again. The officer took a step back. No apology, just a silent receding. Oscar understood the apology, carried it in his posture, in the quiet fairness of his retreat. He continued down the path, the cane's tap a steady heartbeat in the hush of dawn. He passed the lake, where early mist clung low over glassy water. He passed the statues of forgotten poets, monuments to words now ancient. He passed another jogger, this one nodding at him, freer now. The park absorbed him, honoring his passage more keenly than any courtroom once did. But beneath the calm, a question lingered in the air. The man they looked through had walked through judgment, twice first as arbiter, then as subject. He carried both roles with unshakable dignity. And though the park's paths returned to normal after he passed, the moment had planted a seed. Who truly is judged by whom and for what? The stone benches, the golden leaves, the wide sky would hold that seed, waiting for the reckoning that every quiet morning can bring. Oscar Sinclair paused at the stone bridge that arched over the park's meandering stream. The morning light glimmered through the sycamore leaves, and for a moment the world around him exhaled. As he watched the reflections ripple across the water, he felt the residual echo of the earlier interaction, the young officer's gaze, the brief fracture in respect. It weighed on him not with anger, but with quiet sorrow. Because in that tense moment, it wasn't merely his identity under scrutiny, it was trust itself, and how swiftly it can fracture. His cane tapped on the bridge as he walked across the gentle slope. From the other side, he barely noticed two figures approaching Maria Delgado, his granddaughter's best friend, and James Carter, a local high school civics teacher and keen observer of social dynamics. Earlier that week, they had coordinated a small commemoration walk in Oscar's honor to mark his contributions to civil rights law. Today they followed him with permission to witness his morning steps, and in their own way show solidarity. Oscar acknowledged them with a nod, but said nothing. He felt their presence as an extension of what respect should feel like, not forced, not performative, but earned through history and empathy. The shadows of respect, those moments when recognition is given without demand, were rare but invaluable. Maria, brimming with youthful curiosity, asked softly, "Grandfather, do you ever feel safe walking here?" Oscar's pause held all the gravity of a judge weighing decades of precedent against a single line walk. Safe is a construct, he finally replied. It's built over time, but can be shattered in an instant. Maria's expression reflected the weight of that truth. James looked on silent, contemplating Oscar's words. They continued along the path, and Oscar told them about a time decades ago in Atlanta when he presided over a case that challenged entrenched segregation in school districts. He spoke not as a lecturer, but as a man haunted by how decisions made behind closed doors ripple outward to shape public spaces' behaviors and even park benches. The law, he explained, must be more than words, it must become lived reality. As he spoke, Maria and James walked beside him, absorbing every nuance, the quiet power of legal frameworks, the cost of overlooking systemic imbalances, the need for continuous vigilance. They reached the small amphitheater where community groups sometimes hosted poetry readings. The morning was quiet. Dew still clinged to the wooden benches. Oscar leaned on his cane and looked out over the empty seats. I envision gatherings here, he said, voice low but warm. Where we hold conversations, not complaints. Where people share experiences of being seen and unseen. Maria smiled. You want people to understand before they judge? Oscar nodded. Yes. To learn that respect begins with recognition and continues with curiosity. He reflected on the officer's hesitation that morning, how one moment of uncertainty could have escalated if he'd raised his voice, called for backup, or let fear dictate his actions. Instead, a name and a face once seen were enough to reset the interaction. That flicker of recognition, subtle, respectful, had prevented escalation. It reminded Oscar that even when systems fail, humans can restore dignity. Along the path, Oscar guided them to the oak tree, where local elders carved their initials long ago, a tradition and a remembrance. Here, he said, we leave a trace. He placed his cane against the trunk and gently touched the bark. Like respect, it grows slowly, one mark at a time. James knelt, tracing a deep initial carved decades ago. This is what you taught us in court precedent. One act affecting many to come. Oscar's eyes reflected pride, humility, and something deeper. If we maintain that respect in everyday moments, when we look up IDs, when we approach someone on the street, we set precedent too. Every conversation, every ripple. Maria extracted her phone and took a photo, not of Oscar himself, but the empty path, the oak's initials, the open sky. A symbol of what could be built when recognition and respect move in quiet tandem. They walked back toward the park entrance neighborhood, waking behind them. Families, early joggers, and dog walkers formed a soft chorus of normalcy around them. Maria paused to greet a stranger respectfully. The stranger responded eye to eye, not side glance. Oscar watched and offered a small smile, approving. As they reached the wrought iron gate, Oscar paused once more. He looked back at the park's green embrace. We must remember, he said, that respect is not passive. It lives in how we see each other before we see titles, before we see race, before we see fear. Maria squeezed his hand. James nodded, his eyes brimming. Oscar Sinclair lifted his cane, his steps down the path, echoing a legacy that extended beyond law books in every face that chooses kindness over suspicion. The shadows of respect remain invisible unless someone dares to walk through them. Morning light sifted through sycamore leaves as Oscar Sinclair's cane traced the gravel pathway toward the Veterans Memorial. The air held a hushed reverence, as though the park itself remembered his earlier walk, the tension, the recognition, the gentle restoration of dignity. But today, Oscar sensed something different rippling through him. Not gratitude, but responsibility. He carried that morning's encounter with him now, its echo resonating deep in his bones. He'd witnessed authority crumble and rebuild in breathless seconds. Now he wondered, how could that shift become permanent? A soft whistle broke the stillness. Oscar turned to see Officer Brian Huxley approaching hat in hand, his uniform crisp, yet his posture unsteady. Oscar paused, allowing the distance between them to narrow until they stood face to face. Oscar's eyes held no accusation, only calm invitation. "Good morning, Sir Huxley," began, voice low. But words faltered. Oscar inclined his head. "Officer Huxley," he confirmed quietly. "You wish to speak?" Huxley swallowed. Yes, I need to understand. What happened this morning it shouldn't have. I want to learn. From you." Oscar measured the look in Huxley's eyes, remorse, curiosity, perhaps even hope. He nodded slowly and gestured to a nearby bench. They sat side by side, but separated by the weight of events. Oscar folded his hands, allowing Huxley to speak. "I've been reviewing the department's protocols," Huxley said, voice shaking. "And your words struck me. Respect begins with recognition. But so often we forget that, especially under pressure. When we wear authority on our sleeves, the danger is we stop seeing faces." Oscar listened, graceful silence filling the space between them. At times, Huxley's voice faltered with guilt. "I thought I was doing my job. I followed procedure. But procedurally, I didn't stop to ask. I didn't pause to see you. That haunts me." Oscar regarded him, compassion in his gaze. "Authority must echo beyond protocol," he said. "It must resonate with humility, with the awareness that every uniformed step treads on someone's story." They spoke of more than the morning itself. Oscar shared memories of his years as a civil rights lawyer and judged how every ruling, every gavel strike, carried implications. "Law is intellectual," he explained, "but justice is human. And humans feel when they're unseen." He described the Georgia school desegregation case he presided over, recounting how his judge's bench overlooked a classroom where black children sat apart, not because laws permitted, but because those enforcing them did not question why. Huxley's eyes glistened. "I've never sat on a bench like that," he confessed, "but I carry that uniform. I realize now that its weight isn't for me, it's for them." Oscar offered a small smile. "Yes, uniform is privilege and burden, but true authority doesn't demand submission. It invites accountability. It accepts when it errs." The conversation deepened into practical ideas. Huxley suggested unconscious bias training that included real-life scenarios, older black men walking through parks, silent and composed. Oscar added that training needed to include reflection sessions, not just lectures, officers sharing stories of when they felt unseen or when they thought they'd wrongly judged someone. Recognizing our own fallibility, Oscar said, creates space for change. They strolled toward the memorial. Oscar paused before the flagpole where he had stood days earlier. "Our institutions," he said softly, "must echo our highest ideals. Without reflection, authority roars hollow." Huxley agreed. "And I want to help make sure this echoes throughout the precinct." Oscar placed a firm hand on Huxley's shoulder. "Then listen. Listen when dignity whispers. And when it's too small to hear, reflect on why." They stood in silence, the morning sun warming the flag's folds above them. In that moment, Oscar realized this encounter the genuineness of Huxley's apology. His eagerness to repair was part of the solution. Change wasn't just in laws or policies. It was in moments like this, authority greeting humility, accountability meeting compassion. The soft echo of one retired judge and one young officer forging something new in the quiet of a park. Their paths diverged at the gate. Huxley raised his cap. Oscar returned the gesture and offered a final thought. May your uniform speak justice more than fear. Huxley nodded deeply, then turned and walked away each step, deliberate as if the morning had given him fresh purpose. Oscar watched him go, his heart both heavy and hopeful. The echoes of authority tense and fractured this morning were becoming something else lessons carried forward, not shouted, not enforced, but breathed into every walk, every pause, every moment when someone stops to see another not as a suspect, but as a human being deserving recognition, respect, and justice. Morning light shifted gently across the park as Oscar Sinclair took his seat on the same bench he and Officer Brian Huxley had shared. Beside him lay a thin leather folder containing the proposal he had drafted that morning, a blueprint for transforming instinct-driven authority into reflective service. He ran his fingers over its spine as memories of their conversation replayed in his mind how respect demands recognition, how humility births justice. Oscar had spent decades navigating halls of power as a civil rights attorney, then judge, then policy advisor. But this blueprint was born from a moment that transcended titles. It was forged here in this park, where uniform had collided with dignity. He opened the folder to the first page, then paused. This wasn't merely paperwork. It was a framework tied to human lives, to moments of choice that defined communities. The blueprint consisted of 3 core pillars: pause, see, validate. Pause meant creating forced moments of awareness in routine engagements, milliseconds, to uncouple fear and see beyond silhouette. See meant acknowledging each person's names, stories, histories to affirm their humanity, not treat them as threats. Validate meant giving voice to that recognition, even in small conversations to build trust. Oscar believed these pillars could become the bedrock of meaningful change. He closed his eyes and recalled Brian's words from earlier. True authority doesn't demand submission. It invites accountability. Those words echoed in his bones, now guiding the next steps. He took out his phone and typed a message to Brian, attaching the draft. Let's begin here. Precinct Pilot Program. Invite me to brief? We'll train with real people, open dialogue, no lectures. With the message sent, Oscar walked the park's winding path, imagining how this blueprint might ripple outward through precinct halls, city council meeting rooms, police academies, even neighborhood associations. He pictured officers and citizens sitting together, sharing experiences of being unseen or feeling unsafe. He imagined community gardens and benches installed not just for comfort, but for conversation reminders that space is meant for listening as much as moving through. As the park's flagpole came into view, Oscar paused. He remembered standing there, under uniformed scrutiny, the moment silence became statement. That was the moment he decided this encounter could be more than a viral video. It could be the pivot. His blueprint was designed not to shame, but to restore. Not to punish, but to remember. Remember that justice begins when we choose to see. He thought of Brian again. He could imagine the officer handing the proposal to his chief, acknowledging it wasn't compliance that mattered, it was compassion. He pictured precinct commanders mapping out training schedules, curricula remodeled around lived experience rather than hypothetical scenarios. He pictured academy recruiters interviewing cadets, not just on marksmanship or procedure, but on empathy. Tell me about a time you felt unseen. What did it teach you? Oscar felt a profound responsibility settle in his chest. This was bigger than him. It belonged to the community he served. He would offer to brief the local city council, partner with civil rights organizations, engage faith leaders. He would propose bench press sessions where officers practice polite de-escalation, but also where community members practice speaking up. When you decide to stop me and ask my name, do you know what history feels like? He envisioned schools in the region integrating standing still moments, children learning that speaking wasn't always necessary for dignity. That calm could be courageous. Perhaps a silent walk event could be held here in the park. Participants walking the same path in silence as a statement of presence, recognition, and shared humanity. When he returned to the bench, Oscar opened the folder and began drafting pilot participants, officers, neighbors, veterans, faith leaders, program modules, pause drills, story sharing, reflective debriefs. Measurement metrics, changes in community trust, surveys, reduced complaints from elders or people of color, increased diversity in precinct outreach. He sketched a timeline, 6-month pilot quarterly reviews, public reporting adjustments based on feedback. He noted funding sources, grants, local philanthropy, civic associations. As he worked, he sensed movement nearby. Brian Huxley appeared at the approach, eyes warm. He nodded as he reached Oscar's bench and sat. Oscar looked up. "Did you get the draft?" Brian's voice was quiet, hopeful. Oscar smiled. "And I'm ready." He slid the folder toward him. "I can't do this alone. We'll lead together." Brian placed his hands on the folder. His expression was resolute, a young officer taking responsibility for his uniform, but ready to wield it differently now. "Thank you, sir. I'll take this to Chief Mitchell today, and I'll volunteer for the first community circle." Oscar's throat tightened with pride and relief. "That's how this begins," he said. "When we use authority to listen, not push. When we design systems from empathy, not fear." They sat in silence, two men from different eras, bound by purpose to usher authority into accountability, to ensure no one in this city walks bearing dignity without recognition. The blueprint lay between them, unassuming yet powerful, a promise encoded in leather and paper. As the sun rose higher, lighting the flag above, Oscar realized something important. Blueprints change when implemented. Drafts become dialogues. Proposals become programs. Encounters become culture. And culture, more than any badge, defines justice. Standing together, Oscar and Brian rose. They walked out of the park side by side, two individuals now moving as allies, leaving behind a blueprint that would soon guide a community toward deeper recognition, shared respect, and a new way of seeing. Oscar Sinclair's name began to resonate far beyond the quiet paths of the park. In courtrooms, city halls, and precinct training rooms, Sinclair was no longer just a man. It had become a movement, a creed, a refusal to be overlooked. The first ripple appeared at Mon County School District. 2 weeks after the blueprint pilot took shape, classrooms buzzed with unexpected discussions. Teachers opened their lessons with a simple question: who do we see? Students hesitated, then spoke about a neighbor, a bus driver, an elderly friend. Later, fifth graders drew portraits of people they'd never met: a chef, a retiree, a custodian. One drawing stood out: a brown-skinned man in a trench coat calmly standing under a tree. Beneath it, "Mr. Sinclair doesn't disappear." That innocence carried profound weight. Meanwhile, the precinct pilot launched with a silent walk, officers' residence, and city leaders moving along Oscar's route, sharing presence without words. At each stop, someone spoke briefly, "I carry," or "I remember." At Flagpole, Oscar's voice rose above the hush. "We begin with seeing." Phones recorded, but no selfies were taken. This was about recognition, not spectacle. When it ended, envelopes filled with gratitude notes found their way back to Captain's desk. One read, "Thank you for seeing me." That note became the precinct's best performance statistic. Word spread quickly into neighboring counties. Civic groups invited Oscar to speak. He rarely took the stage, preferring circles where voices rose, paused, and leaned in to listen. Power isn't erased by recognition. He told them it's refined. He shared the story of that day, how a bench, a coat, and a badge collided, and how respect had unveiled a new way forward. He didn't ask for applause. He asked for repetition, for each of them to ask a question when fear took precedence over seeing. One evening, at a community center in nearby Harborview, Oscar's folder lay open on a table, surrounded by people jotting ideas. How do we teach police empathy? What about a community-led audit next quarter? How can small towns adopt this model? They sketched town hall trainings, intergenerational storytelling circles, and silent pauses before enforcement decisions. Oscar listened, offered gentle guidance, and moved to the next group. The energy was careful and hopeful, a quiet power building beneath the volley of enthusiasm. Back in the precinct, Officer Brian Huxley was already a changed man. He knelt during a public forum, not in shame, but in service, asking a survivor of profiling to share her story. His uniform shimmered under the hall lights as he held the microphone for her. Later, he whispered to Oscar, "I couldn't unsee what I learned that day. Thank you for showing me what authority can look like." The media called it the Mon County model. It wasn't built on arrests or policy edicts. It was constructed around shared presence. Oscar's file became a blueprint uploaded to open-source civic platforms. Civic leaders from across 20 states downloaded it. Faith communities held teach-ins. School districts quieted classes to share the moment of silence under the oak. Then came the day Oscar received a letter sealed with pressed flowers from a high school in South Carolina. Inside, the student wrote, "You made me believe that we are all allowed to take up space." He placed it in his jacket pocket and stood again at the flagpole bench, feeling its quiet resonance spread. It was then he realized the most powerful testament wasn't the press release, the training deck, or the pilot's KPIs. It was the name that had unclenched hearts, softened minds, and echoed across living rooms and locker rooms alike. Oscar Sinclair had become more than a man. He had become a mirror, an unerasable name, reminding everyone that dignity isn't granted, it's recognized. When a black man simply stands still and the world begins to see him, everything begins to shift. Oscar closed his eyes, breathed in the afternoon sun, and whispered, "Let my name remind us that presence is a right, not a threat." Oscar Sinclair's journey is not just the story of an elderly black man detained in a park. It is a quiet epic that pierces the national conscience, exposing how deeply rooted assumptions can reduce even the most accomplished lives to shadows when viewed through the lens of bias. His calm defiance, rooted in years of disciplined law and service, echoed louder than any raised voice ever could. What began as a simple walk through the leafy serenity of Baldwin Park in Birmingham unfolded into a profound reflection on the fragility of dignity when it collides with misperception. Oscar didn't ask to be a symbol. He didn't seek confrontation. He didn't wield his past as a weapon. Instead, he stood still, steady beneath the flagpole. His trench coat buttoned his spine straight, not out of arrogance, but out of principle. His silence became a statement, and that statement, captured in 34 seconds of viral footage, became a mirror for a country often unwilling to see itself. A retired federal judge, an architect of justice, a veteran who had given decades to shaping the legal backbone of this nation, Oscar was rendered invisible in an instant, not because he failed to meet the standard of law, but because he surpassed the assumptions made by those who enforced it. It wasn't just the officer's mistake that stung, it was the casual, mechanical nature of it. The hand near the holster, the request for identification based on nothing more than presence and skin. It was the coded language, "You match a description." "You seemed out of place." Phrases that have historically served as gateways for unjust scrutiny. Oscar's story reminded the world that even the highest-ranking architects of justice are not immune to the erasure triggered by racial profiling. And yet he didn't crumble under the weight of that moment. He did not shout. He did not resist. He did not explain, because he understood, more than anyone, the burden of constantly having to justify one's right to exist. His quiet was not submission, it was control. It was history. It was strategy. That stillness shook the system more than outrage ever could. And that is where the true brilliance of Oscar Sinclair's resistance lies, not in confrontation, but in conviction. When the footage spread and the media caught fire, the world began to learn what the officer had failed to ask: who was this man? They discovered a scholar, a builder of justice, a man who had shaped policy on oversight, testified before Congress, received national commendations, and lived with integrity through eras that offered him little in return. But they also learned something harder to accept: that credentials don't always protect, that respect isn't automatically extended, that sometimes even a man who wrote the rules can be criminalized for walking while black. But Oscar didn't let the incident become about him. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't center himself in the narrative. Instead, he returned to the park the following Sunday, same route, same coat, same composure. He knew that his power wasn't in being recognized. His power was in being unshaken. In doing so, he handed the microphone to a younger generation, to students, veterans, scholars, and everyday citizens who saw in him the echo of a struggle they too had endured, and a model of how to endure it with grace. The city issued statements. Policy reviews were launched. Training modules were revised to include the footage of Oscar's encounter. His image became part of murals and exhibitions. But Oscar stayed grounded. He cooked for neighbors. He answered letters. He sat on the same bench, under the same tree, watching how people looked at him differently now, not because he'd changed, but because the illusion that rendered him invisible had been shattered. So what can we learn from Oscar Sinclair first? We learn that dignity isn't granted, it's held. It doesn't require validation, applause, or performance. It simply exists rooted in self-respect and a life lived with principle. His story teaches us that authority without curiosity leads to injustice, that assumption without inquiry is a form of erasure, and that silence when grounded in truth is often the most powerful indictment of all. We also learn the importance of presence. Oscar didn't need a podium to be heard. His stillness became a force. And in our own lives, we too can practice that form of presence by refusing to shrink. When our value is questioned, by standing firm when others assume we don't belong, by showing up fully and letting our composure challenge the biases in the room. Whether in workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, or parks, we can all carry the blueprint Oscar left behind to live in truth, to speak through action, and to never apologize for taking up space with dignity. His story reminds us that progress isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet refusal to be diminished. Sometimes it's choosing not to explain ourselves again. Sometimes it's just walking a path we've walked for years and letting others catch up to the reality we've always known. So if this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel a ripple of recognition, don't let it end here. Let Oscar's quiet strength inspire your next conversation, your next pause before judgment, your next decision to see someone as they are, not as the world expects them to be. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, need to be remembered, then help us continue that mission. Subscribe to this channel, hit the bell icon, and share this video with someone who needs to see it. Because Oscar Sinclair didn't demand to be seen. He simply stood still. And because he did, the country had to decide whether it would finally start seeing people like him, not just with their eyes, but with their conscience. Let that be the beginning of something greater, and let's keep telling these stories together.